When it comes to drawing characters, it's important to learn the anatomy, but I think it's also important to learn what can go wrong and how to fix those mistakes. So that's what we'll be covering here. I do need to point out that even if I'm calling these mistakes, some of them are not necessarily wrong if you do them with intent. That said, some are also genuinely mistakes and will make your drawing worse even if you do them intentionally, so that's why you need to be aware of these mistakes. To start with, a lot of mistakes are because of perspective. Even if something seems like an anatomy or a proportion mistake, it's most likely because of the perspective. So for every mistake I'm going to be talking about, fixing that mistake does not necessarily mean that you have to practice anatomy. Usually it means you have to study perspective more. Now the first mistake I want to go over has to do with proportions. The torso can be divided into three parts. We have the rib cage, we have the waist, and then we have the pelvis. The rib cage is basically one solid form, and then the pelvis, which is connected to it by the spine, is also a solid form. The waist is the area in between them, and this is the area where the torso can actually move. So when we're drawing a pose like this, we can see that the rib cage and pelvis parts of the torso stay solid, and the bending occurs at the part in between them. So if you want to draw the torso accurately, you need to make sure that you keep track of where these three parts are. Now the mistakes that people can make with these proportions is that they either make the rib cage too small, you can make the torso appear too wide, or you can make the waist appear too long. If we measure the torso in heads, it's about 2.5 to 3 heads tall. Out of these proportions, the rib cage is about half the length of the torso, and then the waist and pelvis are both about 1/4 of the length of the torso. So what you can do if you're going to draw the torso is you can first decide how tall you want the whole torso to be. Then you can split that in half, which tells you where the rib cage needs to be. You can split that in half again, which tells you where the waist needs to be, and then you can place the pelvis all the way at the bottom. What can happen a lot too when drawing stylized characters is people can make the torso appear too wide, which usually happens because we study how to draw real people first, and that's what the proportions look like for real people. So when we're drawing stylized characters, we draw the proportions we're used to instead of the proportions that we need to draw. Now to fix this, I would say you should closely pay attention to how other people draw these proportions, and you can do that by measuring as well as looking at landmarks. Like for example, we know the head is meant to be this wide. If we compare that to the torso, it's about the same width. And I should mention again, it's not wrong to have more realistic proportions if you want to do that, but it has to be intentional. And this actually isn't that good of an example. Here's an artwork I made a couple years ago, and you can very clearly see those bigger proportions in the torso, and I see this constantly with beginner artists especially, so make sure that you pay close attention to this. Another difficult thing about drawing the torso is making it look three-dimensional. To make anything look three-dimensional, you need to make sure that it exists in the height, the width, and the depth dimension. To accomplish this, we use boxes because boxes perfectly represent these dimensions. With boxes, we can clearly tell where the front plane is, where the side plane is, and where the top plane is, and we can do this because of the 90-degree corners. The torso also has a clear front plane, side plane, and back plane, but the plane transitions are a lot rounder, and this makes it harder to draw the body accurately in 3 dimensions. The mistake is that people draw the torso, but they get these plane transitions wrong. So instead of it being a transition from the front plane to the side plane, it's more like a transition from a front plane to a kind of diagonal plane. You can kind of demonstrate this with a piece of paper where if we give it this boxy shape, we can see that we have a clear front and side plane right here, and we can see the transition at the top. But if we change it from being this boxy shape to being more of a trapezoid shape, the transition from front to side plane kind of disappears, and you can see that the whole form appears to be more flat, because we now don't have a front and side plane, we have a front plane and kind of a diagonal plane. Now what you can do is of course draw boxes first, which as long as you've drawn them properly, define the three-dimensionality, and then you can draw the torso. The problem that you might run into is that these boxes also define the proportions instead of just the perspective. So if you use these as guidelines, meaning you draw directly on top of them, you'll run into an issue where you somehow have to fit your rib cage and your pelvis inside of this box, and you have to make the proportions make sense. This is really hard to do because these forms don't perfectly fit inside of boxes. So instead of drawing on top of your boxes, what I recommend doing instead is drawing the whole body with boxes first and then using it as a reference. So look at how this corner is angled, for example, and then when you're drawing the actual body, make sure that you replicate that angle, which is what lets you replicate the perspective. Now the last thing I want to go over is how to get the perspective right on the ribcage and pelvis. The ribcage and pelvis are both solid forms, meaning if one side of the pelvis tilts up, the other side will tilt down by the exact same amount. The form itself cannot change, so it functions exactly like a box. This is true for the pelvis, but the ribcage is a bit different. The ribcage can technically move because this front part is made up of cartilage, which is able to very slightly bend and stretch. We can see it in a pose like this, where the back of the ribcage is very slightly bent instead of curving this way like it normally would. That said, even in a pose like this, it's still not bending that much, so don't go overboard with bending the ribcage. For simplicity's sake, I recommend always thinking about the ribcage like a solid form similarly to the pelvis, and only when you're drawing a very stretched out pose should you think about the movement of the ribcage itself. Now the ribcage and pelvis are also able to move independently from each other, so one can move this way while the other one is still facing up. And this type of movement happens to a lot of poses where contrapposto is applied, so basically the hips are angled this way and the shoulders are angled this way. But because these forms function similarly to boxes, we have to apply box perspective. If the box is above the horizon line, we can see the bottom plane and we can see lines converging downwards towards the horizon line. If the box is below the horizon line, we can see the top plane and we can see the lines converging up towards the horizon line. This is also how it works for the body. The bottom and top parts of the ribcage will go towards the same vanishing point, and the bottom and top parts of the pelvis will go towards the same vanishing point. In this case, all of them are going towards the same vanishing point because they're parallel to each other. But if the pelvis was tilted like this, for example, the pelvis would be going towards a different vanishing point compared to where the ribcage is going towards. Now, the mistake you can make with this is that you don't think about these forms like boxes, which will cause you to ignore the perspective convergence, and that will make your forms appear flat. What's difficult about this is the fact that the arms and legs are able to move as well, and in the case of the arms, they can move independently from the ribcage. So sometimes you'll see the shoulders being angled one way, but the ribcage will be angled a different way. This doesn't really happen with the pelvis because the legs don't have shoulders, so instead they always have to follow the same angle as the pelvis. To avoid making these perspective convergence mistakes, I recommend doing the same thing as we did with the previous mistake. Treat them like boxes first, make sure that you get the convergence right, and then reference this box when you're actually drawing the torso, which will tell you how things need to converge. But those are some of the most common things that I see people do wrong when it comes to drawing the torso, and there is of course a lot more stuff that you can do wrong with the torso, and I might cover those in future videos. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, let me know what you want to see next. You can always join our Discord server through the link in the description if you want to participate in the homework exercises, and you can also support the channel through YouTube memberships. But I guess I'll see you all next time.